Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Claudio Tagliapietra. I teach here Fundamental Theology under the guidance of Professor Tanzelaniti, whom I really thank for inviting me here today to deliver this class on Christian revelation, the birth of Western culture, and the rise of the scientific method. So before starting, why don't we say a prayer? Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Pray for us. Good. Can you hear me? So can I keep this volume? Okay. So just a line about myself. Before teaching theology, I was a researcher in economics at the University of Bologna, and I was interested particularly on political economy, law and economics. And after some years of research, I moved to the University of the Holy Cross here to finish my studies and thank to God to be ordained as a priest. So I am a priest. This is my third year of priestly ordination. And so I'm here today to deliver this class, which is about an intersection of my favorite topics. The first one is the last one entering in my specialties, while the other two, and the second is one of my passions, and the third, again, another of my passions. And seen in this way, this is a difficult title, as you see, with a very bold claim and a challenging task, I would say. And we should look at this topic wearing the glasses of a theologian. And they are two particular glasses. So they are the glasses of a man who reads reality in the light of what God has revealed to man about himself, about man, about the world, and about salvation. And we want to have a look to a relationship that is arguably detectable in human history. These three elements are in a relationship that we should investigate in this class, or we are attempting to. And this relationship has to do with the world in which we live today. And this is a complex relationship between a historical event, which is the Judeo-Christian revelation, a historical event, and about his diffusion, and the birth of what we call today the Western culture, and the rise of the scientific method. And the latter, the scientific method, as known, arose within the Western culture in a certain context and a certain time that, for simplification, we can locate in a temporal timeline at a date and with a reference name. We can pick the year 1623, year in which Galileo writes the Essay, in which he explains his experimental method. Thus, the historical relationship we are going to investigate is the following. Is this one. Revelation, Western culture, and scientific method. But before that, I skipped the example I wanted to start this class with. And it is the following one. So, looking at those two figures, we might think that they are not related. In some sense, they are not, of course. So, as I show, this is a Neolithic grainstone for processing grain, and we can locate, and I have a look to Ivan, this quite expert on this topic, about 10,000 years before Christ. I put before present, which is the international notation for. And this is Voyager 1, a space probe that entered the interstellar space outside the solar system in 2012. So looking at those two objects, we might think, does Christian revelation have anything to do with this? And in some sense, yes. Yes, but the relationship is quite tricky to show. So it's not a direct causal link or a direct relationship. We have to enter those three elements of the relationship I was talking about, and precisely this one. So, what I offer here is an argument that is built on a set of seemingly correlated historical evidence linking three elements: revelation, Western culture, scientific method. And the argument goes as follows. I try to make it clear. The discovery and implementation of the scientific method has been undoubtedly a game changer, and is rooted in the diffusion of Christian religious tradition. And thanks to the scientific method, Homo sapiens went from grindstone to sending objects in interstellar space for now. And thanks to this method, man reflects on his position in nature in a quite unique way, we would say. And thanks to this method, man can reflect on his own very nature and destiny. But the grounding principle of this method, which contributed to shape the world as we know it today, are a complex mix of factors that are strongly rooted in medieval science and in history, and in a deep and intricate relation between culture and religion. And we should buy this relationship between religion and culture. And it's not an easy one. And this relation is undeniable and has been undenied by every serious scholar in history and in the sciences. Normally, we study the West as a result of the intertwined cultural and environmental processes. This is one possible way to look at the story. But we recognize that the philosophical and cultural background of the scientific method are, like it or not, the offspring of a precise spiritual inheritance, the Judeo-Christian tradition. This tradition began in a very specific historical context, in a very specific period, and propagated at some time throughout the world in a very specific dynamic. And as theologians, not anymore as scholars only, but as theologians, we are enabled to offer a reply to those who question why and to which purpose. We might say as theologians, because at some day we know Christ will recapitulate everything. But as historians and theologians alike, we stick to our common playing ground. And we simply note that the spiritual tradition contains the right ingredients for the rise of a culture that fosters the rise of a scientific method. But what are these ingredients? Again, and what if we neglect the religious roots of the world we live in today? Would the world be the same if we leave out for a second one of these ingredients that we are going to address? So we shall start from the end and how we move forward. So we start by outlining some elements of Christian revelation useful for our discussion. Then we move on seeing some example of institutions that are at the base of what we know today as Western culture and why they are rooted in Christianity. And then we move on the grounds of the scientific method. Okay, so needless to say, I don't even attempt to summarize what has been written on this topic. This is there is a huge literature for each of these topics. And the basic bibliography, there is a reference list on the website, is merely illustrative. But especially for the second and the third topic, there are 2 pages on this educational platform that I hope Don Giuseppe will show you at the end of the class. One was written by myself. It is the contribution of Christianity to the formation of Western culture. And there is another one, Can we talk about a Christian origin of modern science? That is, I would say, within the big questions of that platform. So, we start with the first topic. What is this? I make a big jump. So I showed you a greenstone, and we make a leap forward of 8,000 years, basically. And this is Ur. This is a zikkurat. It's a zikkurat, and we are basically in the 3rd millennium before Christ. This is Iraq, and is Ur. The city of Ur, basically the first city humans were able to build, or something like I see Ivan that is nodding, saying no, not much, but we take it for because it's a useful reference for our biblical world. We know that in this area there are the historical roots of Judeo-Christian revelation, the Fertile Crescent, about 5,000 years before Christ. And this is the environment in which basically all the story about Revelation started, at least the Judeo revelation. And we aim to make an interdisciplinary claim, have an interdisciplinary take on the topic. And for the moment, we shall probably recall some useful elements for our argument. So, God, creator of heaven and earth, creates man and desires communion of life with him. He manifests to him as the one and the only God in history, to Abraham, from Ur. And by a mysterious design of gracious love, God decides to communicate himself to humanity, and he does so in a historical and a gradual way. Manifests himself to our forefathers, makes covenant with the patriarchs, manifests himself to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, frees the people of Israel from the slavery in Egypt, sends them into the desert for 40 years, promises them a land, sends kings, prophets, who communicate God's salvific will, and in the fullness of time, God the Father sends his only begotten Son, incarnate in the womb of the Virgin Mary, through God, through man, etc., etc. Sorry for being so quick, and to fulfill his plan of salvation on every man, Jesus of Nazareth, a rabbi, son of a carpenter from Galilee, reveals himself as the Christ. He preaches, suffers, dies on a cross, resurrects around the year 30, and sends disciples into the world, and gives them the assistance of the Holy Spirit, remaining present and alive in the church, in the sacraments, until the end of ages, when all things will be recapitulated in Christ. Okay, this is a bit of a summary of the story we all know, so what about this? But seeing through the eyes of the historian and archaeologists, the Judeo-Christian revelation arises in this very specific context. And it's not an instantaneous event. Is itself the result of a cultural process in a specific context, namely the one we see here, the Syro-Mesopotamian society and the spirituality that this society has developed in the Near East. For further study, I recommend the fascinating book of Giorgio Buccellati. I don't know if anyone here knows Professor Buccellati. Writes a beautiful book on the roots of the biblical spirituality. But even a cursory read of Genesis 1:11, not a cursory, but more a scholarly and an exegetical one, is enough to realize that the amount of material from other surrounding cultures present in the Bible in the very first chapters of the Genesis. But this, however, does not constitute a problem or an issue for the theological reality of revelation, as God may well inspire the sacred author, as we know, by drawing on existing material to communicate himself intelligibly in the specific cultural context we are seeing here. But a question may arise now, and we can formulate from a revelation knowledge point of view or from the agnostic point of view. How was it possible that a contextual culture, sorry for the unhappy expression, but it's a culture that has a context, such as the Jewish revelation and specifically the preaching of an obscure Galilean carpenter, let's put it that brutally in this way, could propagate in a very short time, relatively speaking, throughout the whole world? Or why Western culture has diffused in the world and on another? Of course, there are many proposals. This is a fascinating question that had many answers, and a lot of them. And I would collect them into three groups, two basically. For simplification, we can collect them into proposals proper to a framework of pure immanence. So we can explain them only by material causes or by things that we can see or we can study in history. We can have some proposals that critique those proposals and proposals that are open to transcendence. And going to the first one, in a purely immanent framework, we could say that way, the question seeks answers only on the basis of the interaction of earthly forces, and may take other radical forms as well. For example, why was precisely the Western culture that arises from this culture, why is this precise culture that diffused around the world and not another? And we need a probably more refined definition of culture, of Western culture. But scholars dealing with this type of question consider the ingredients that shape the West as we all know it today. And they might be a combination of the following. We might find innovation. I put that in I's just for sake of remembering more easily. So technology, agriculture, language, writing, gunpowder, metals. So I'm quoting some of innovations, some technologies that made possible the diffusion of the Judeo-Christian or the Western way of thinking things. Inquiry, reason and reflection. Any culture is struck by a sense of awe and wonder, but only a particular, the Mediterranean, say, way of thinking as the one who diffused around the world. Since philosophy, ideas of being, good, beauty, truth, the way they have been developed or thought about in the Mediterranean world. Institutions. Any society in the world develop institutions. But why precisely those in the Mediterranean moved and diffused so far from their center? And wealth. So if you combine them properly, at the end, the result, according to these authors, is a special way, a special mix that diffuse around the world. Of course, this is a process that we call in economics endogenous, so in which it is very difficult to disentangle causal links or to establish a cause and an effect. But economists, sociologists, and scientists in general are really keen of working out these kind of relationships. And I pose here some of the most interesting popular books on the topic. So we find Jared Diamond, this one, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1998, and who has an interesting, he's a geographer from UCLA. I think this book is quite known. And we find also Ian Morris, who is professor of classics at Stanford University, but this is a really popular science book. And we have, for example, another book of a less known Phil Hoffman, professor of European history at Caltech, who argues that, I put some notes about this guy, who was really passionate of Europe, and Professor Hoffman argues that 4 conditions allowed the Europeans' path toward global dominance: frequent war, and sadly today we know for sure that is that, high and consistent military spending, adoption and advancement of gunpowder technology, and relative lack of obstacles to military innovations. And economic conditions allowed Europeans to spread around the world. But this is not a really engaging or hypothesis, I would say. Finally, much more recently, Sapiens. This book of Harari, probably some of you already read something about this guy, and on this platform you should find also a review, a detailed review. In particular, Harari presents a narrative that is overly materialistic, I would say, to be concise, an outlook on man's journey in history that is also explicitly anti-metaphysical and anti-religious. I'm saying this because in the book, the same author describes himself in this way. So we find also some critiques of these proposals. I should have a look also to the clock. At what time should we have a break? Okay. To give a critical and informed answer to the question I showed before, we need to consider a relationship, a tricky one. This is about religion and culture. This is quite difficult and challenging to, send a relationship and try to debate such a complex relationship in just a few minutes, but there are libraries about the topic. And I had to pick some authors to tackle this relationship properly. We require a perspective that by no means treats the contribution of individual sciences as absolutes. A fragmented knowledge treats each science as an all-encompassing hermeneutic, capable of explaining everything, and not as a piece of a jigsaw, for example. And as a result, if we take the relationship between religion and culture as the relationship between two absolutes, we might end up unhappy about what we see. And we might see it as a stage of a never-ending conflict between philosophical and political ideologies. But a vision of synthesis, which it is what we try to do, is, on the contrary, values the contribution of each science to a global vision of this relationship, and which corresponds to what religion and culture are together, and what are their role in a civilization. And I think one of the most important voices about these perspectives is a professor of history, Christopher Dawson, which happens to be one of Britain's foremost historians, who died in 1970. And he writes The Age of Gods in 1928 and Religion and the Rise of Western Culture in 1948, which is basically a collection of lectures he delivered in Scotland, the Gifford Lectures in 1947. And in religion, and basically, and specifically in this second book, Dawson writes the following: Western culture has been the atmosphere we breathe and the life we live. It is our own way of life and the way of life of our ancestors. And therefore, we know it not merely by documents and monuments. And we should take this suggestion also when we will consider the second and the third topic of this class, because we will look at Western culture as, for example, with three examples: hospitals, universities, and Monte di Pietà. But we would not be happy of exhausting all the topic by looking simply at documents and monuments, but from our personal experience, what we are experiencing today. Hence, any study of religion which ignores and leaves on one side the accumulated experience of the Christian past and looks exclusively to the remote and partially incomprehensible evidence derived from the study of alien religious traditions, or even to our own abstract notions of the nature of religion and the conditions of religious knowledge, is bound to be not merely incomplete, but insubstantial and unreal. That's an interesting take on the topic. And always in religion and the rise of Western culture, Dawson defines the relationship we were looking at between religion and culture as the intricate and far-reaching network of relations that unite the social way of life with the spiritual beliefs and values, which are accepted by society as the ultimate laws of life and the ultimate standards of individual and social behavior. For these relations can only be studied in the concrete, in their historical reality. Sorry for the typo here. So we move to proposals open to transcendence. And we ask ourselves, okay, what are the ingredients, therefore, that allow so widespread diffusion of Christianism in the what we call today Western world or worldwide? And it is undeniable that in a pagan context in Greece and Rome, some very important religious ideas spread, many of which were introduced also in the early centuries within the Judeo culture. And it is well known that Christianity creatively assimilated the institutions and the ideas of the countries where Christians lived and worked. And it's quite possible that Judeo-Christian ideas spread in a correlative fashion to the geographical spread of Christians. What were the innovations, so therefore? So the big ideas, let's call them in this way, related to the conception of men that arose in the Judeo-Christian sphere and spread throughout the empire. One is creation ex nihilo. Creation is present also in myths of other religions, but in Christian context, this idea tells that man is the image and likeness of God. Man is capable of understanding the cosmos in nature. Scientific thinking can originate from this idea, compatibly with awe and wonder at the origin of philosophy. So creation ex nihilo is very important. Then also typical, unique of Christianity is incarnation. And in some very specific way, resurrection as well. The concept of person, from which we derive the dignity of the person, freedom, equality, brotherhood, or values that are at the base of modern states, of modern democracies, and so on and so forth. Then the opening of human reason, we can recognize that man has a reason, but this reason is open to transcendence. And these ideas paved the way to the development of Christian philosophy and theology, and consequently of a Christian humanism, in which we can say that religion is not against reason, but is its capacitation at fullest. And what we observe empirically all over the world is simply the fruit of it. We might think in this way, however debatable it can be. It is important to acknowledge the existence of narratives that are open to transcendence, that take into account the historical knowledge of the relationship between religion and culture, and they are very useful for our discourse. And they too propose a theory of history, but one that is open to transcendence. And the proposal can come from a theological history, I would say. Theological history, so a theory of history that is that has a knowledge and a theory of history that can embed a theory of revelation, or one from a good sociology of religion. And I would like to briefly outline two examples, one from each. So we start from example from theological history. And the idea I want to present is the one of Angelo di Berardino from a book he wrote. Basically, it's not a book, but it's an address he gave to in Spain as I will give you the account exactly. So he wrote Christianity, Geography and Diffusion and Organization in the First Centuries of Christianity, 2016. And the second one is from Sociology of Religion. It is the idea of Rodney Stark from The Rise of Christianity, published in 1996. And we can have a brief look at them separately before our break. So what we can say, we can see here two maps. So the purple dots are the sides of Christianity in the first century. The blue ones are the diffusion of Christianism within the second within the third century, Christianity went all the way to the black dots. How was it possible? And from there, in the following centuries, this is the patterns of diffusion of Christianism. But Di Berardino notes that in the ancient world, in the early centuries, only Judaism and Christianism required conversion. But Judaic conversion involved renouncing to one's ethnic deities, all ties of kinship and connections to one's homeland. We don't know names of Jewish missionaries, for example, although we know that pagans became Jews through conversion. And therefore, probably when they came into contact with Jews in places where they were in trade or by reason of the diaspora, and thus in places where Jews built a synagogue. So this is how pagans might become Jews. And we know that synagogues formed a network throughout the world in the early centuries, a network of which Christians took advantage. Christianity, differently from from Judaism, from its very beginnings, presents himself as missionary, proselytizing religion, and underlying the ideas of Christianity, there are the concepts of sender and sent. So the Father sends the Son, the Holy Spirit is sent too, and the disciples too are sent. And the Judaism from which Christianity arose was not missionary. There could be sympathizers, converts, but the purpose of individual Jews and Jewish communities were not to increase in numbers. And Christianity, on the other hand, by its very constitution, had to spread everywhere, was born to spread throughout the world, had universal aspiration. And those who spread Christianity are innumerable from the first generation. So we find apostles, 12, their associates, Paul, Barnabas, many missionaries who are mostly unknown. And as long as Jews and Christians could not distinguish themselves, the synagogue network of the diaspora, in some cases, was a fundamental basis for Christian mission. And this is how Angelo de Berardino thinks Christianity spread. Gradually, we come to we could say, in Constantine, the Edict of Milan, that basically made possible and made available Christianity to all over the empire. And it was the first step before the recognition of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. As a consequence of the edict, religious life in the Roman Empire is such that a key date in the history of the Western world is basically the Edict of Constantine. So we move and to the diffusion of revelation according to a sociology of religion, Rodin-Stark hypothesis, well known, and Stark points out in his hypothesis of a number of advantages that Christians had over paganism to explain his growth. For example, Christians and plague. While others fled cities, Christians stayed in urban areas during plague, ministering and caring for the sick. The care for the sick, for example, was a very important drive for demographic and spatial growth of Christianity. Christians and demography. Christians were not used to practice birth control, abortion, infanticide, fertility and ideas, and cared for the old. Again, Christians gave a huge and important role to women in their societies, and the spread of Christianity is to a large extent due to women, believing women. Christianism, epidemics, and disasters. Okay, this is a variation of the first one, but during epidemics and disasters, Christians stay in towns and helped other people. And Christians and martyrdom, this is what made, according to Rodin-Stark, credible the message of Christians. They were able and were able to die for their ideas, and this made credible their word. Breaking news. And so we have a short break, but I should make everyone aware that the book is finally out. So I write here, available at Amazon, not anymore, so be patient, but the book is finally out. So we can congratulate Professor Tanzelanetti for these achievements. So if you don't have any question, we may have a short break. I can address questions afterwards. So we can continue. And we move to the second topic, which allows us to enter into the topic of Christianity and the origin of Western culture. So finally, we have to give a definition of what we now mean for Western culture, and we can give this working definition. The cultural, scientific, and technical spiritual development experienced in geographical areas rooted in the values of Greek and Roman civilization and crossed by the decisive impulse of Christianity. So what we saw on the map, in all the places where Christianity arrived, we can imagine that this network also brings together the ideas of Christianity. And having analyzed the possible reason that led Christianity to spread in all this region, starting with the Mediterranean and then moving to the rest of the world with the geographical discoveries, and we now seek to understand its impact, the impact on society, and recognize some of its clues in today's institutions. And most historians agree that Christianity has played a role of synthesis, but also of promotion of innovative content. So the ideas that are rooted in their religion, the four innovations, that religious innovation that we quoted before, generated other institutions, other innovations. So that according to British historian Christopher Dawson, that we all know him now, the contribution of Christianity over the last 2,000 years has been more than simply significant. It is the culture to which we all in some sense belong. This is the starting, as Dawson starts his lectures, his Gifford lectures. So, what were, and to a great extent still are, the elements that provided Christianity this humus, this ground on which the civilization that today we know grew and flourished. We can, before moving to the example, we can reconnect with some of the ideas quoted before. So we have a new vision of the human person. And man is devised as a subject of freedom whose dignity is rooted in the common relationship with God. And we have the gradual affirmation of the idea that all participants in human rights deserve to be to have their rights recognized and defended. Then the specific care for the human that is manifested, for example, in the birth of hospitals and other initiatives to defend the weakest. Also, the person that asked for credit and risks to go bankrupt because he is not able to repay the debt that he has contracted. For example, this is what moves to the foundation of Monte di Pietà. And the first one is in Ascoli in 1458. And also the idea that human dignity requires education. Education is not only a transmission of a content, but also sort of giving back to man his original dignity, allowing him to have what he needs to enter the knowledge of the universe. And this passion for education and for the need to provide a higher education, and this higher education must be provided by some other institution, is what moves the birth of universities. Why did I pick these three examples? If we think they are basically the key elements of the modern welfare state. Healthcare. Here in Italy, we have the ASL, the healthcare system that was very, very efficient. And we know that every country in the world has an healthcare system, or should have, or hopefully will have. We have a system for higher education, universities everywhere, and also banking institutions, or finance and other. And they all have, or basically in their better version, a Christian origin. And I am aware that providing these three examples, we are providing an idea of the West that is really down to flesh. We go back to Dawson that suggests not to describe a society only by its documents and monuments, but this is made for just to have three examples in mind if we happen to speak with friends or to other people. Hospitals, universities, and Monte di Pietà. We can give some ideas for each of them. So hospitals, I placed a date here, and does anyone know where was the first hospital founded? Where? Not quite. I would say in Turkey. In Turkey, in Cappadocia, and then was Cappadocia, and the first hospital was Basiliade, founded, we can hear from the name, by Basil the Great, that was the bishop of this region. And we find this news from the historian Sozzomeno, which mentioned the existence and the operation, and this hospital was operative in Cappadocia, and was called Basiliade Famous Ptocotrophium. Ptokos is the poor, built by Bishop Basil of Caesarea. And this quote is from Historia Ecclesiastica. And Basil, who had developed a medical sensibility during his stay in Athens, and was well acquainted with the assistance used in the monastic communities, decided to ask the emperor to found this hospital. It was incredible, this ambitious project. He wanted to found an institute that would take care of the sick and the needy, equipped with the best medical equipment of the time, with experienced medical personnel, lodgings for the elderly and for the sick, a hostel for travelers as well, a hospice for lepers, normally abandoned outside of the city, and of course with a church and a monastery. And those who worked in the complex basically was called a fortress for the needy. Had access to kitchens, refectories, bathrooms, warehouses, and stables. And according to the testimony of Basil's friend, Gregory, it was a real fortress. And the patient would remain in the facility for as long as it was necessary to complete the treatment, with a roof, bed, food, and staff to attend for his personal needs. Incredible. And there were alleys in which the dirty laundry passed without crossing with the clean laundry for hygiene reasons. And this was part of a very tricky economic operation that made this fortress basically famous all over the empire, and started to spread all over the empire, so that in the Middle Ages, when Western monasteries were provided with medical facilities, it was said that they had been built according to the Eastern customs. So we refer to these institutions, hospitals, that have his forefathers in the Basiliade. Then we can move forward to hospitals. So hospitals and then universities. I placed this nice figure on the background, and we see a very familiar figure here. There is someone sleeping. Someone sleeping. I created the right environment, so we have many representatives of this guy here. So when were the first university built in Europe? We know that, according to a legend, the first one was Bologna. Were you studying in Bologna? Were you a student of Bologna? Of course, yeah, our alma mater. Fantastic. I did my doctorate in economics in Bologna, so we are brothers to some extent. And so the first universities were founded in Western Europe, more or less in the 12th, 13th century. So I picked this period because we find the greatest number of universities. And we have some key dates. So we have the Lateran Council III, which established a theological chair in each cathedral church, entrusting this chair to a teacher who would teach the clergy and lay people free of charge. And then the Lateran Council IV. Then we have some centers of higher education that were founded in the following years. And to a similar extent, similar to experience already present in the Islamic world, where we find some institutions similar to our university. But the European university, let's call it this way, were often created as an extension of the cathedral schools of theology, as in the case of Paris, for example, but mainly as meeting places for students and teachers who were lacking the premises or stable structures dedicated to common mission. Their common mission was studying, research, love for truth, and the unity of knowledge. So I placed a map here of the first universities. So one can look, here Bologna is placed first. As we see, then we have some geographical expansion, but not only, because also Oxford here is in 1190. Then Cambridge some years later. But we know that some of these dates are, to some extent, not to offend anyone, to some extent almost legendary, unless you find a document. But we can take Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge, the last three ones, as the one with the most certain dates. And they were founded on the basis of schools that were already well organized and later received from the papal or the imperial authority recognition, a recognition of independence, of autonomy. Autonomy and the qualification to issue the academic title of doctor. And around the 13th century, the meetings between teachers and students gradually took the juridical configuration of studium. They became a studium and promoted by association. And the Latin word for association is universitas. Universitates of teachers, as in the Parisian case, or universitates of students, universitas of students, as in the case of Bologna. So they are associations that brought together students from different European countries that had to interact with the local municipal, imperial, and ecclesiastical authorities. So it was a very tricky relationship, the one of students and of teachers with the surrounding world. And soon they acquired an autonomous statute. And the universitates began to have their own juridical and jurisdictional authority. And until the 13th century, theology was taught, for example, and in the theological studium of Paris, where St. Thomas Aquinas studied as well, while that in Oxford was famous mainly for logic and science. And from the 14th century in Bologna, the study of medicine, liberal arts, and theology were added to the first faculties of Roman and canon law. And in Rome, here, the first real university, the Studium Urbis, was established in 1303 by Boniface VIII and corresponded to the original nucleus of the current university, La Sapienza, which then passed to the Kingdom of Italy in 1870, after the suppression of the Papal States. As in Bologna, it originally held courses in theology, literary subjects, civil and canon law, medicine, and surgery. So, what characterizes these institutions, and this is what they are meant for, is the unity of knowledge that was reserved for theology, basically, had a privileged but not hegemonic role. In fact, of the 50 universities that existed at the end of the 14th century, only a little more than a half had a faculty of theology. The others added other theologies, other subjects. And according to the American historian Brad Gregory, who wrote a very interesting book on called The Unintended Reformation, the Unintended Revolution. And in this book, Gregory argues that basically Protestantism, the reform basically changed everything in the world as we know today. The process of secularization of culture that began in the 16th century led to a progressive specialization of knowledge, to the exodus of theology from the university classrooms, and finally to its marginalization within institutes of theological education and in pontifical universities where we learn theology today, at least here in Italy or also elsewhere. As a result, the gap between secular culture and theological knowledge and the fragmentation of knowledge became more pronounced until today. We know that in Italy, the suppression of theology chairs in state universities took place in 1873. So from that moment, we are not surprised in not finding theology in state universities anymore. We move to the third innovation, Monti di Pietà. In the background, we find an image portraying the first Monte di Pietà in Ascoli. And Monti di Pietà, so just to be clear, they are not quite similar to banks. So they are basically institutions to manage small loans. And they were founded as a result of Franciscan preaching in the 15th century to allow access to small loans to the less poor. That is, those who, despite being at the limit of their subsistence, could request a loan upon the provision of a pledge to guarantee the repayment of the sum. This is what we call peño. And these institutions required only a low rate of interest. And this characterized the Monte di Pietà with respect to other institutions providing loans at the moment. The Church considered the activity of lending at interest immoral and allowed private credit to be managed by other social components, generally Jewish entrepreneurs, by means of appropriate authorizations. So the scene we see in The Merchant of Venice, the poor Jew who lends the money needs an authorization. But the problem with these loans was their extremely high interest rate, 20 or 30%. And this interest rate is not within the reach of everyone, of course, and was indeed very risky. Thus, the idea of the Mount of Mercy matured in a Franciscan circle as a Christian solution to the problem, to provide as a substitute for alms a disbursement of a loan guaranteed but a small pledge, which allowed the less well-off to go back to work and then repay the loan without ending up on the breadline. And some 15th century preachers, such as Bernardino da Feltre, this is one of the key figures preaching, began to spread the idea of collecting money from citizens and authorities in order to establish a pool of resources. The idea of loan is quite simple. We have people who have money, we pull money from these people, have a pool, and then from there we can give loan with a small, asking for a small interest rate. And the object offered in pledge needed to have a value of at least 1/3 of the sum borrowed. So this was the price for the risk. We could say it in those who know a bit of insurance. The interest charge was about 5%, so it was quite low, to protect against the risk of insolvency and for self-financing the Monte di Pietà, who had also some costs of running, and to expand the possibilities of relief. But originally, the interest was zero, in compliance with the gospel principle, lend expecting nothing in return, in Luke 6:35. The period granted for repayment was usually 1 year. So I give you the money and you give back the money in 1 year. And if the sum was not returned within the agreed period, the property pledged was sold at auction. So we have also a system of auctions parallel to the one of the Monte di Pietà, working in the very same place. And okay, so the first one was in Ascoli. Here are some more technical ideas, but we should move forward. Then we have Perugia in 1462. Then in 1515, there were 135 Monti di Pietà in operation in basically 50 years after, 200 throughout central and northern Italy. And today, this institution is still existent. It's still operational. But they operate under the name of Monti di Credito su Pegno, following their merger with banking foundations. At least for Italian law works this way. I don't know how it works elsewhere. Basically, merger with banking foundations and joint stock companies operating in the credit sector. So, in a while, we move to the other topic. But in light of what we have seen until now, we cannot but agree with Dawson, who believes that Christianity played a decisive role in developing new social institutions. These three institutions, for example, were not existing before. And we cannot deny that these three institutions are basically at the base of the state we know today, the welfare state. And according to Dawson, this is nothing but the result of a process of cultural assimilation that also finds conscious expression in the literary tradition. We are not going deep in this topic, but we can see, for example, the life of the saints in the Laws of the Kings, says Dawson, in the letters of missionaries and researchers, in the songs of poets. So we have a great deal of evidence today about this idea of the Western culture and its Christian roots. And we move. On the last, I believe we have 20 minutes, I would say. and I can stop a bit earlier so that Professor Tanzeraniti may address some final words before the end of this course. So we move to Western Christian culture, that we all know where it came from and what are these grounding principles, and scientific method. We move to Voyager 1, what led from Greenstone to the Voyager 1. And here, there are plenty of interesting books I might suggest to read. I would offer 4 references here. Oh, finally, pleasant to see a slide with some special effects. Galileo Goes to Jail. This is one book published by Harvard University Press by Professor Ronald Numbers. And Professor Numbers recruit a group of leading scholars to write a sort of new history of science geared to dismantle a good number of myths in science and religion. So, very good book. And I jump basically to the last one, For the Glory of God, as an important essay, again by Rodney Stark, published in 2004 by Princeton University Press, in which the author, Stark, well known, argues that whether we like it or not, people acting for the glory of God have formed our modern culture, including science. There is a really interesting chapter on science. A third one, this is popular science. This is a physicist, James Hanna, who writes about God's philosophers, a narrative history revealing the roots of modern science in medieval world, and a companion book, quite different, with a, I would say, compelling narrative, is the one by Seb Falk, professor of history in Cambridge, The Light Ages, a medieval journey of discovery, the science in the medieval age. Quite interesting. And other references are these ones. David Lindbergh, The Beginning of Western Science by Chicago University Press in 1992, and Edward Grant, The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages by Cambridge University Press in 1996. There are for both second editions. So the basic story from books like that is that contemporary science is the result of a gradual development that began in the 13th century, and whose decisive moment was the scientific revolution of the 17th century. We named at the beginning of this class Galileo in 1623, the year in which Galileo published the Essay, where he outlines his scientific method. And the turn to a modern scientific mindset took place in a Christian context. And we should recognize this piece of evidence. And its main characters share which kind of ideas did they share? The idea of a rational universe, that the universe is intelligible, and that the universe is the effect of a creative intelligence. And sorry for using this word because it may be misunderstood. But let's put it in this way. Yes, this is a creative intelligence. Moreover, the Christian theology of creation favored the idea of nature that was no longer divine, but instead available to experimental investigation. And there are also other ideas that paved the way to the rise of scientific method. Other ideas are, for example, the trust in the rationality of the cosmos and in the logos that presides creation. And then the idea that the laws of nature are universal, stable, and communicable. So three questions that are addressed in the page on the this educational website and you can have a look to that if you are familiar with Italian and if you have right now an internet connection in Grandi Domande. So the questions that the author there, Alessandro Giosta, addresses are three. Yes, there was a slide that I should have passed on before, so we move directly to the three questions. When and where does the scientific method begin? So here we have, for simplicity, a date and a name. And we can collect this idea under the name of Galileo in the 17th century as the start of the scientific revolution. But we know there are many other names following Galileo. And what are the reasons behind the thesis that Christian theology fostered the rise of science in the West? In light of what we said, we might have some arguments right now. And what has generated the persuasion that Christianity has hindered the development of science? This common misconception that tells that Christianity, in some sense, if we remember the four ingredients before, the four I's, Christianity and religion in general is an obstacle to the development of one of them, of those ingredients, or to the complex as a whole. Have the events linked to authors such as Giordano Bruno, Galileo Galilei, and Charles Darwin influenced its genesis? Because when we talk with a friend who's not familiar with science, or neither science nor religion, and not particularly a religious person, always they say, yes, the church, Giordano Bruno, Galileo Galilei, witch hunt, and Charles Darwin. The church hates these guys. So, nothing more wrong. So we move to the first one. The modern scientific method, Alessandro Giostra says in this page, can be reduced to two fundamental components: reliance on the mathematical model applied to natural reality, and the adoption of experimental procedure based on quantification, while on Aristotelian grounds we should stick to quality. And both components, this mathematical view of reality and the adoption of experimental method, come to full maturity during the scientific revolution. Although we know, and we see from those books that this is quite studied, their origins can be traced to the developments of natural philosophy during the phase of scholastic philosophy. And in other words, in terms of not only the content but also the methodology of science, the modern turn had essential antecedents in earlier centuries. And we make plenty of names, I would say. The principle of a rational and reproducible world is combined, moreover, with the rejection of any animistic or pantheist perspective, which is increasingly abandoned during this scientific revolution, is abandoned and relegated to the realm of superstition. Of course, this was not an immediate process. It is not that Galileo publishes his book and then the day after people says, of course, this is all superstitious. And the discovery of the medieval origins of the scientific method is relatively recent. We might be surprised of this. And refers to the research that is carried out at the beginning of the 20th century by the French scientist and philosopher Pierre Durem, who died in 1916, whose investigation show a link of continuity between the methods adopted in modern physics and those of late scholasticism. This is a very interesting read. Then we can move to the second question. Sorry, this canocchiale, this is an invention of Galileo. Second question, what are the reasons behind the thesis that Christian theology fostered the rise of science in the West? And we have to pay attention to an essential consideration, I would say, that it's not possible to separate any movement or approach of thought from its general cultural context. We have to go back to the cultural context. And we have to reflect on an indisputable historical fact, that science, in its contemporary meaning, was born in the period of history that we call the scientific revolution. And we have plenty of works, not only the one of Galileo. We have, for example, Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium of Copernicus in 1543. Then we have also the work of Newton, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1687. And this scientific revolution took place in a Christian cultural context. We just need these three names, for example, but we can add many more. And not within other intellectual context, also present in previous centuries. One can think, for example, ancient civilizations that contributed to science, for example, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, or Indian, or Chinese. Of course, all this civilization contributed to progress the mathematical field of civil engineering. But it's not within them that the fundamental equations relating to motions of bodies were formulated. And we may ask why. And this is not an easy answer, of course. And we need a unified vision of the universe based on mathematical reduction of phenomena, which was not possible to conceive anywhere else, probably. And in the West found an important ground in the work of the authors, for example, like Copernicus, Kepler, Galilei, and Newton. Okay, so, and we end briefly with this last question. What has generated the persuasion that Christianity has hindered the development of science? Here we find plenty of literature as well. But basically we can answer that the idea that Christianity would have hindered science has probably its origins in the Enlightenment culture in the 18th century. Whose deistic principles entailed the rejection of Christianity and general religions of revelation. So the progress achieved with the scientific revolution contribute to see science and empirical knowledge as basically the only plausible form of knowledge, because it was rational, was understandable, it was intelligible, and it was affirmed that a mechanicistic conception of nature, in which God was denied or relegated to the role of a kind of engineer at most. And so we have a devaluation in this period of the religious dimension that is taken up by positivism. We can just remember the best known example of this approach, which is probably the Law of the Three Stages by Auguste Comte. And according to this French philosopher, humanity goes through 3 stages of development. The first of which is theological or fictitious. Then we have the metaphysical, abstract, that precedes the last, the scientific, positive stage. It is the only harbinger of true knowledge. So we can see in positivism, pure positivism, can be considered part of all those philosophies of the 19th century that, despite their diversity, fall within a naturalist approach. Good. So I think we can stop here. And if there are any questions, we can address it. I can address them right now. Otherwise, I will give word to Professor Tanzelaniti, who will end this wonderful course. And in the meantime, I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
We all were part of an experiment. Perhaps you didn't know that we are part of an experiment. The experiment was discourse, because this is the first time that we organize a course like this in this University Santa Croce. So feedbacks to this course are very, very welcomed, because we are thinking to give this course every 2 years, changing a bit of the program. So please, I encourage you to email me your observations, remarks, suggestions for the future. Be sincere, absolutely. No? What you liked, what you don't like, everything. Okay. So this course was organized by a Center for Religion and Science active here. The Interdisciplinary Documentation Center. Well, what are you doing?
I'm duplicating the monitor.
Okay, thank you. And I want just to show you the 3 most important websites that we added in this Religion and Science Center in order to offer you possibility of documentation, study, and so on. Okay, fine. So the last and most in this moment, I would say the last and more beautiful website is this educational, which is in Italian, and is addressed especially to teachers of high schools. And many of the issues that we tackled in this course are present in one of the sections of this website, Big Questions. Could we speak of a modern origin, to a Christian origin, of a Christian or of modern science? We have a short reply here, and then an organized answer, structured in many other subsections, with videos, a glossary, and so on. Okay. So the other website is just this.org. Just very rich. You have here the sections of this website. And the English counterpart of the DISF website is Inter's website. Interdisciplinary Encyclopedia of Religion and Science. This is the home page. This is the encyclopedia. There's also a call for articles if you are interested in submitting articles to this encyclopedia. Okay. Then we have anthology and documents here. Okay, so you have a database which hopefully will be useful for you if you are interested in going more in depth in this kind of study. Okay, that's all. Thank you so much for attending this course. And please spread this, this initiative to your acquaintances and friends, and we hope to give the same course with some changes in the next 2 years for the master of the philosophy and theology also here in the Santa Croce. The course will be open to every pupils also coming from other institutions, not only pontifical institutions, but also state institutions if they want. They have to enroll themselves. They will gain credits for their curriculum. Okay, thank you. Bye.